Good morning, everybody. Glad you're with us this morning on AM Indiana. Our program today, well, we have two gentlemen who are both geologists. One says there was a Noah and a Noah's Ark, and the other one says not so. We'll talk to them in just a moment. Stay with us.
Live from Union Station in the heart of central Indiana, this is AM Indiana with Dick Wolfsie.
Good morning, everybody. Glad you're with us this morning on AM Indiana. We have an excellent show for you today, and I'm sure that you will find it very provocative and controversial. Both of our guests this morning were educated in a similar way, both educated as geologists, but they have very different points of view as to the origin of man, and a little bit more specifically today, we're going to talk about whether, in fact, there was a flood, Noah and the Ark. Was that a reality? We're going to talk about the archaeological evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about creationism and whether, in fact, man began as Adam and Eve and whether there was a flood. Let me introduce our guest to you right now. Our first guest is Professor John Morris. Dr. Morris is a PhD in geological engineering and a leading expert in the world on Noah and the flood, among other things. He has written books including The Adventure on Ararat and Ark on Ararat, and made a couple of trips to the mountain. Is that correct? How many trips?
Well, I've been to Turkey on several occasions to see if perhaps the remains of Noah's Ark are still on Mount Ararat.
Good enough, sir. Also joining us, Frank Zindler. And Mr. Zindler is formerly a professor of geology and biology. He is now a science writer in Columbus, Ohio, and he's a leading spokesperson on atheism in the country, and he is presently the director of the Central Ohio Chapter on American Atheists. And good morning to both of you, gentlemen. Good to see both of you. Professor Morris, let me start with you. And as you know, I've been wrestling with how to begin this because I know there are so many things to talk about. But let me suggest something to you and have you respond, and then I think I can probably sit back for the rest of the show. Is it your contention, sir, that until Mr. Zindler proves otherwise, you're going to accept the fact that there was a Noah and a Noah's Ark, or do you believe, in fact, sir, that based on your trips, you have some proof?
Let me tell you something about science, Dick. Science exists in the present. Scientists all live in the present, and all of the facts are in the present. The fossils, the rocks, everything is in the present, and we do our experiments in the present, we study in the present, we make our conclusions in the present, and that's where science is, the scientific method, experimental observation, reproducibility. When we start talking about the long ago past, the unobservable past, even in principle unobservable past, we've left the realm of strict science, and we're into this area of faith. Now, there are at least two ways of looking at the past. One is this evolutionary worldview that the Earth is billions of years old, and another worldview is that perhaps the Bible is right, and that does represent accurate history. But in a real sense, either view is outside the realm of science and into the realm of faith.
One more question, Frank. Let me ask John one question, and then I promise I'll sit back and let you go at it, because I want to understand something from where you're coming from. You and Mr. Zindler were trained in a similar fashion at good schools. You're in the area of geology. So let me ask you this, and I'll let Frank jump in. You, I'm sure, were taught that the Earth was billions of years old. Is that correct, sir?
That's right.
Okay. So are you here to say that what you were taught and the method that they reached to come to that conclusion was inaccurate?
The idea that the Earth is old is a historical reconstruction. I mean, nobody was back there to see it, you know, to measure it. What I say about the creationist young Earth worldview, we can't prove that the Earth is young. We can't prove that the Earth is old. The facts of geology are compatible to some extent with the idea that the Earth is old. The facts of geology are compatible with the idea that the Earth is young. Now, I'm a geologist. I love rocks. I love fossils, and I have a lot of them. But I've never had a rock talk to me. I never had a rock tell me how old it was.
Okay.
You've got to interpret
let's see if the rocks talk to Frank.
They might talk to him.
Well, first of all, his definition of science is rather bizarre. It would rule out almost all of science. Science is hypothesis testing, John, and you certainly can test hypotheses about the past.
But you can't test history.
Yes, you can. Absolutely, you can.
What you can test is the results of history in the present.
Yes, from the results you can infer quite definitely what happened. Now, you claim that in your book, Ark on Ararat, you claimed that you found some sedimentary rocks on Mount Ararat with fossils. Now, I wrote to you a year or so ago asking about this. I never got an answer. I suppose that the letter got lost at ICR or something. But I'd like to ask you now, just what kind of sedimentary rocks were these on the top of Mount Ararat, and what fossils were in them?
We're talking about a switch of subjects.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to answer your question, the fossils were shells,
What kind of shell?
Dated as Cretaceous sorts of things, supposedly on the order of 100 million years or so old. Now, I don't buy the date, but that's the normal conventional date to it.
Now, were these xenoliths that had been brought up with the lava, or what?
No, it was in a sedimentary limestone layer.
Frank, help us understand where you're going with this, because you guys are having fun, but I'm
yes,
lost.
No,
I don't know what he's talking about either.
Fine. That's fine.
Tell me what you're getting at here.
Creationists don't understand mountains, basically. They find fossils in the tops of mountains, and they say that that is proof of Noah's flood. Now, why they're in the mountaintops instead of on the mountaintops is something they rarely answer. Now, in the case of Mount Ararat, this is a curious problem, because Mount Ararat is a volcano. It's not a mountain made up of sedimentary deposits. And to say that there are fossil deposits on top of Mount Ararat would imply that it had been underwater.
Frank, your problem is that you say, I don't understand geology. What you don't understand is creationism. In your articles written about me, and
Yes.
You have such a total misunderstanding of what creationists do say.
Be specific, Dr. Morris. Tell
Okay,
Frank what he misses, and then...
Okay, in this subject, I have never said that those fossils were on top of Mount Ararat. Those fossils are within sight of Mount Ararat.
No,
They're
you
an
say
upturned
that there were
strata.
sedimentary strata on the top of Mount Ararat, or on Mount Ararat. I don't know that you said they were exactly on the top.
I reported that in 1969, a glaciologist claimed he found a fossil layer at about the 14,000 foot level. The fossil layers that I've studied are some 10 miles away. They're
Well, I know you
truncated.
said that also, but you claimed that there were fossils in the rocks on Mount Ararat, and that's why I
Frank,
wrote
help
to
us,
you.
so what? Help us understand.
Okay.
So
claim
what?
That
Yeah.
would imply that Mount Ararat had been underwater. He also said that there were pillow lavas. Now, no one else has ever found pillow lavas
Oh, that's not true.
on Mount Ararat. Now, that's crazy to think that there would be pillow lavas there. In fact, we have
okay.
an archaeologist from Columbus by the name of Garby, and every time he goes climbing Mount Ararat, I say, well, now you look for those fossils, and you look for those pillow lavas, and they never find them. The photograph in your book is not of pillow lavas. You say it's pillow lavas. Pillow lavas are lavas laid underwater, under great depths of water. And they form like pillows because the lava congeals so rapidly, and they have glassy constitution.
I got to stop you. What do you see? Again, I want to think about the person at home. Like, if I were home, I'd be lost here. What is it that you would have liked to have found, or did you find on the mountain that would have suggested to you that there was a Noah's Ark? And then I want Frank.
That's a good question.
Okay, what did you find, or would you have liked to have found, other than the Ark?
In a very schizophrenic fashion, he has brought up several different subjects here. I never claimed that there were fossils on Mount Ararat. I do claim that one fella claims he found some at the 14,000 foot level. I have never seen them, and I have looked for them. The mountain is a volcanic mountain. The type of lava that is on Mount Ararat is consistent with the type that's laid down underwater under great pressure. The aspect of it being pillowed, that's a very specific type of lava found at the deep sea trench and different things that is recognizably laid down underwater. It is a field judgment call. As a geologist trained in these sorts of things, I found lavas that, in my opinion, were pillowed.
And that would mean...
And I have pictures of those that show the very
laid down underwater.
Okay.
fracturing.
Now, you say on page 7 of your Ark on Ararat that Mount Ararat was created on the third
He read it,
day.
don't laugh. He bought the
Was
book.
created on the third day of Creation Week, along with the ocean basins, but that at that time Mount Ararat was only about 10 to 12,000 feet high. Now, if all the water came down in 40 days to drown all of the mountains of the world, that would require the rain to have come down at about 11.5 feet per hour. John, that's not rain, that's hydraulic mining. Everything would have been swept off the surface of the continents. The continents would be absolutely denuded down to crystalline rocks. All the sedimentary rocks would have been deposited in the ocean basins. Now, clearly that's not the pattern that we see, and it certainly would imply that that does away with Noah's flood.
Frank, let me say, if you're going to be critiquing my book,
yes,
or if you're going to be critiquing the Bible, which I do believe, what you need to do is handle that data honestly. Now, what you have just
what
said
have I done
about
dishonestly?
Me is not what I wrote in that book.
On page 7, it's there.
Okay, but I go on page 8, 9, 10, and 11.
I know you contradict yourself later in the book. You know, later on you have the ocean basins coming later.
If you're going to talk about my works, or if you're going to talk about the Bible, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. I'm going to make sure you characterize
I'm
it
going to try to keep you honest.
And not an unfair caricature of what I said.
Well,
I did not say that.
A caricature.
I did not say
it's
that.
It's comic book science that you write, John. Now, if that
we need
mountain
to,
was
we need to have an
10,000
understanding
feet,
here.
Okay, if that was 10,000 feet high, where did all the water come from?
We need to talk honestly, Frank.
Where did the water come from,
We need
John?
to make sure that we're talking facts
Okay.
and not your
Well, I'm just
cartoon
repeating what you
caricature
said. If it's
of
not
what
fact,
said.
I can't help that, John.
Okay.
Okay, where did the water come from to drown Mount Ararat, 10,000 feet in 40 days?
What happened to page 7 being created on day 3? You know, if we're going to talk about a subject, let's talk about a subject. You change it in mid-sentence.
Well, no, wait. Okay, I'll tell you. We have to take a
We've
break
got
here.
to figure out where the water came
What
from.
question? Wait, I'll tell you what
You
we'll
just
do.
brought that question up.
What
I got an
question
answer.
you decide what question you want to ask. I'll
I've
decide
asked
what
it.
question you want to answer, and we'll do that when we come back in just
All
a
right.
moment. Stay with us. We're back on AM Indiana. Both of our guests this morning were trained as geologists, but if you tuned in even a couple of minutes ago, you know we have some real basic disagreements here about the origin of the Earth, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and that's what we're talking about. Let me ask a question, and therefore neither of you can avoid it, okay? If you just take the story of Noah, as I understand it, it seems to me there are certain aspects of it that appear to be on the surface rather implausible, if not a miracle. How he got all these animals on the boat, how big the boat was, how big the boat had to be. So my first question to you, sir, is do you need to explain those things, or are you simply going to say, well, God did it, it was a miracle, no explanation necessary?
I think the story of the flood clearly has its miraculous aspects to it. But by and large, the kinds of things that are mentioned in the scriptures regarding Noah's flood are natural processes. I mean, we're talking rainfall and erosion and deposition. And these sorts of things are present processes that are studyable and understandable. And in those areas, by all means, I do believe that the flood account is compatible with the geologic data. Now, we can't prove the flood. We didn't see the flood. It's totally outside the realm of our experience. And so we can only argue by analogy of that. My study of geology has shown me that, by and large, all of the rock units that are on the Earth's surface were laid down by catastrophic processes. We have a big study of Mount St. Helens, for instance, and we study that terrible catastrophe, and we see the sorts of things that went on. That dinky little volcano, I mean, it wasn't too dinky to those that were on the north side of the mountain on 1980, but that dinky little volcano did the sorts of things, laid down the sorts of layers that we see in the geologic record throughout. All of geology is beginning to move toward this catastrophic interpretation of the rocks.
So and this is what I sort of asked before, your contention is your approach that your study of the geologic data shows that evolution as we understand it may not be right, or your study shows you that in fact that there was a Noah, or you're still unclear proof on either side?
The point is, science can't prove the past. What a scientist can do is study the present and do a historical reconstruction. What happened in the past to bring the present into the state it is now? That's what a scientist can do. That's what I do. That's what Frank claims he does.
Okay, Frank, what about Noah bothers you? What about the Ark story?
Now, we certainly can see the past. For example, when we look through a telescope, we see a star or a galaxy.
Doctor Who here. It goes
a
back in
galaxy
time.
that's millions of years ago. We're seeing it as it was then, not now. But anyway, getting back to Noah's flood, he hasn't answered the question of where did the water come from. And as I pointed out, we would have had to have so much water come down in 40 days in order to raise sea level almost 2 miles, that we would have 11.5 feet of water coming down per hour. This would have scoured off the surface of all the continents. All the sedimentary rocks would have been laid down in the ocean basins in one great jumbled mass. That is not what we find. The fossil record, the rock record, shows many cases of rock things that had to have been formed very slowly and gently. For example, the chalk cliffs of Dover and the chalk deposits. These rocks are made entirely of the remains of fossil microscopic organisms. You couldn't possibly form a deposit like that in 1 year's time, let alone in the jumbled mess of Noah's flood. How could you get the chalk deposits in 1 year?
In order to interpret the past, in order to try to explain how any particular rock unit was laid down, we see them in the present. We study them in the present.
Sure, and the chalk
Even
is
you
being
don't
formed
have
now.
Doctor Who's time machine to go back and see.
Chalk is being formed now. We can see it happen.
That's right. But we have to impose on that data certain assumptions, a certain interpretive framework. In geology, we're taught, you were taught, I was taught, that the present is the key to the past.
Sure.
And by studying the present, at least by analogy, we can assume we know something about the past. But as I say with Mount St. Helens, there are episodes in the present which give us a peek into a very catastrophic possibility for the past.
It shows the 27 buried fossils at Yellowstone Park. It shows very clearly how those 27 layers of fossil forests were buried. But getting back to the chalk, how could chalk have been formed? These are microscopic fossils of organisms. There is a very strict limitation as to how many of these organisms can live in the sea at any one time. There are the remains of little granules formed by algae, the so-called coccoliths. You can only grow so many algae per square meter of surface of the sea in one time.
Let me tell you the error of your thinking, Frank.
Mm-hmm.
You're making the assumption that the present is the key to the past.
Oh, you're saying that the sunlight didn't, in the past, sunlight didn't limit the
In the
growth of algae?
laboratory, there are a number of different studies that have been shown that these different algal organisms and the different things that are in that chalk deposit, they can grow, they can duplicate, they can double in their volume every day or maybe several times a day if the nutrients are right, if the temperature is right. I'm claiming that during Noah's flood, there were locations, there were spots in this global flood where the waters were incredibly nutrient-rich, where the temperatures were large enough to have what we call an algal bloom. Or
in the darkness of all this water coming down during this flood, when we would expect that the sky would be extremely overcast, in fact, it should have been completely dark. How are we going to grow algae?
It was dark. I don't see that in Scripture.
There's a hell of a lot of water there that's still coming down.
It was a storm. No doubt about that.
Let's go from the microorganisms, which I can't see.
Well, how about the coral reef?
Let's talk about the big animals. We got to take a break here. I want to know what was on this boat and how many animals were on the boat, and let's get into the big picture here, because that's what people understand. We'll do that in a moment. We'll be right back. Back on AM Indiana, talking about Noah's Ark, and Frank Zindler, let me ask you very specifically. Let's get from the little tiny things to the big things.
Okay.
What about the story, the size of the Ark, and what Noah would have had to have put on the Ark troubles you, and then Professor Morris can respond.
Not only is there the problem of how to get all of the species of land animals into the Ark, the primitive people who created the flood myth in the first place, in the 4th millennium BC or whatever, didn't realize that plants were living things, and they didn't realize the implications of Noah not taking fishes and marine organisms into the Ark. If we limit ourselves to just the water that is known on the planet and the volume of sedimentary strata that we know of, and if, as the creationists claim, all these sedimentary strata were deposited during that 1 year, the ocean at that time would have been actually 2 parts water to 1 part mud. Now, if that were the case, with this world-destroying flood, how would the whales have stayed alive? They could not have been swimming through, straining out plankton and so on to feed. Delicate corals die if there's just the tiniest bit of silt in the water or change in water temperature and so forth. So Noah would have to have had enormous numbers of aquaria in the Ark to keep the whales going, to keep the marine fishes from dying because of the dilution of the salt water with fresh water, to keep the freshwater organisms alive because of the salt coming in and all these noxious things that the volcanoes are throwing out. Incidentally, if all the volcanic lava beds that we see interspersed between these sedimentary rocks were laid down during 1 year, the amount of heat released from that lava would have raised the water of the oceans to several thousand degrees centigrade, and so Noah's Ark would have to have been air-conditioned.
And how many animals on the boat? How many species?
Well, there's at least 1 million species of organisms known. And the creationists say, well, we wouldn't have to have all the species, we would have maybe a general representative of them. But even so, with the need for the aquaria, a boat simply the size of an ocean liner would be inadequate.
Okay. Frank, you are critiquing the biblical account here. You're saying that Noah the Bible.
Yeah, a very ignorant book, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
Very unscientific.
You are critiquing this account.
Well,
where Noah had to take the fish on board.
I'm saying it was in error because they didn't know he had to take the fish
Wait a minute.
on.
What you're saying is the biblical account is wrong.
Yes.
Because there's not room on board for all the fish and whales and things.
No. It's wrong because they didn't know.
The Bible doesn't claim that they had to be on board.
That's why it's wrong. You see,
Now,
for it to be a plausible argument, they would have had to say, and he had to take the fish on board, and the corals on board.
Let me show you what this is.
Yeah.
This is atheistic logic here.
Well, he doesn't deny that.
No, he doesn't. And he's an atheist. He's Madeline Murray's right-hand man.
I'm just showing that the Bible is pre-scientific, you see.
An atheist assumes a very arrogant position in my mind, that there is no God. Now, every philosopher knows that there's no such thing as an absolute negative. He's saying there is no God.
No, you have to prove
Now
there is
he's
one.
saying,
I don't have to disprove it.
Okay,
You have to
no.
prove it.
But you're making...
The onus of proof is on you who allege.
But to say that there is no God, that's illogical.
On
You
the
can't
contrary,
say
it is extraordinarily illogical to say that there is a God who couldn't tell the people who wrote the Bible that they had to take fishes and corals in the ark.
Now
That's
your
dumb.
logic is gone in the same direction. You're
Yeah.
saying that I know for a fact that no whales could have survived outside
I
the
would
ark.
hope you would know that.
Well, you're making the statement that you know this knowledge that no whales could have survived outside the ark. Now, I think that's an illogical statement. The flood is not as you characterize it. Let me tell you some things about water.
Destroyed the world.
Yep,
supposedly.
you betcha. By the billions, fish, clams, whales died in the flood. Oh, well, not billions of
You know,
whales,
that's
but
an
by the
interesting point.
billions.
There are too many fossils for one world. If you were
Well,
to
Frank, now, you know, I was just about to understand something, and you're changing on me. Now, wait a second.
you can't have all the known fossils
I
living
know,
at
but
one
wait, I was
time.
just on the verge of getting something here. You're claiming that the fish didn't have to go on the ark because the fish just would have survived because they were in the water anyway.
The Bible's very explicit about what goes on the ark. It says the land animals. It says all those in whose nostrils is the breath of life of everything that lives on the dry land. So we didn't even, I mean, that's excluding whales.
That's
of course.
right.
They breathe air, but they don't live on land. It talks about cattle, domesticated animals. It talks about creeping things, evidently small animals, and then beasts of the field, which are the large animals. And it says very explicitly that those had to be on board the ark, and the birds. Now, he says millions of species. If you add up that number of species, you know, the maximum number even that anyone would even propose would be on board the ark would be, I mean, the outside maximum, the worst case scenario, we're talking maybe 50,000 animals. And the ark is certainly big enough to carry that number of animals for the length of time that they had to be on board.
Now, you think that there...
Now, what he's saying is that he's adding to the story. He's saying that the story makes no sense unless you put the fish on board. I think that's an illogical addition to it.
You've never raised tropical fish, John. You would
Well, let me tell you
know
something
how
about water.
difficult it is to keep fish alive.
Well, let me tell you something about water. There are many, many studies where waters of different temperatures, of different salinities, of different chemistries segregate. And during the flood, there would have been zones of fresh water, of salt water. There is again, billions of sea creatures died in Noah's flood, but all the biblical account requires is that two of each of these created kinds would have survived somewhere in a pocket.
Somewhere close enough together that they could get back together after the flood. And the
that's what it
stratification would be
requires.
impossible, John, because of all the volcanic activity you talk about going on. This would be churning this up all the time.
Well,
You just wouldn't have...
John, were there dinosaurs were there dinosaurs on this ark?
The flood account does not
I might as well
predict...
throw in something else.
Go ahead, throw it.
No, I got to take a break. That's why I'm trying to stop.
Sure there were dinosaurs on the ark.
Well, I want to understand, because I want to talk about when this flood occurred, and then I think a fair question is, if there were dinosaurs on this ark, how do you know, how is that in keeping with how we know that men and dinosaurs didn't exist at the same time? And if there weren't dinosaurs, where'd they come from, since all the species were wiped out? That seems like a fair question. I'll try to remember how I asked that in just a moment. Stay with us. Okay, we're back. John Morris, I was taught when I went to school, it may not have been the school you would have sent your kids, but the school I went to said that dinosaurs predated man by millions and millions of years. I think a fair, just straightforward question is, were there dinosaurs on the ark? What do you think?
I think there's a great deal of evidence that dinosaurs lived during the same time that man has lived. This is what the Bible seems to indicate, and there is a great deal of evidence that we can marshal in support of that idea.
There's no word dinosaur in the Bible, though, I assume.
Well, there is the word, it's the Hebrew word tanim, which is translated in many places dragons. And I think, in fact, I speculate, we don't know, but you know, people that study about myths, like myths of dragons, and it is true that almost every culture around the world has legends of dragons. They all, I mean, and they describe these dragons in much the same way as we draw our dinosaur fossils. And I suspect that the legends of dragons come from encounters of people with dinosaurs, and that they not only lived at the same time, but have died out in fairly recent times. In fact, even in the Middle Ages, sober scientists who were listing the animals that were alive at the time listed dragons. Alexander the Great has a very sober history of a encounter with dragons, and most of the historians of the day list dragons as if they were real.
Frank, in your opinion, it's incontrovertible evidence that dinosaurs and man could not have existed at the same time?
Yeah, that is not true. Of course, dinosaurs do exist today in the form of birds. Birds are descended from small bipedal dinosaurs, but with that exception, there are no dinosaurs surviving at the end of the Cretaceous period. The whole thing, though, is why aren't there any all over the place? Now, one thing, getting back to Noah's flood, if that had occurred, you see, we should have a mixture of fossils from the bottom to the top of all the different types of living creatures, as well as all the known extinct forms. The Cambrian deposits, 600 million years ago, supposedly, according to him, supposedly, we should find in the Cambrian rocks, we should find at least a few traces of human habitation, along with trilobites, along with other types of forms, oak trees, we should at least find pollen. We should find all of these things all jumbled together if they were all...
Okay, that's a fair thing. Do we find human beings, as we know human beings, and dinosaurs in the same, what do you call it, sedimentary deposit? Do we ever find that?
Let me tell you some facts about the fossil record. 95% of all fossils that have ever been found are marine invertebrates. They're like shellfish and a lot of fish, but mostly of these ocean bottom dwellers. The flood, as an event, was an oceanic sort of event, and the kinds of forces that we envision as having been involved at the time would have been just right for the preservation of oceanic creatures. Those same forces, which I envision mostly as huge tidal waves and massive catastrophic forces, when those tidal waves come in, what they're doing is basically scouring at the bottom. And as they curl back down there, the forces involved would be right for the deposition of oceanic creatures and would be right for the destruction of land sorts of animals. Much less than 1% of all fossils have anything to do with land. I mean, dinosaurs, there's a few of those. There have been, several thousand dinosaur fossils found. There have been a few but mammals are just real rare, and in fact, the mammals that are found, I feel, date from after the flood, during events like the Ice Age, which were land-associated events, which would have been just right for fossilizing land creatures and not for oceanic creatures. But basically, the fossil record shows clams at the bottom and clams with very little change all the way up to the top. And that's the kind of thing we find.
Well, I think people who study clams would be upset by that generalization. But anyway,
well,
we do
I'm not
have,
an expert, but I can't tell the difference between the two.
We do have fossil deposits, like the Karoo deposit in South Africa, where there are over 800 billion vertebrate remains. Most of these are mammal-like reptiles.
Actually, that number is an apocryphal number. I traced it out one time.
Oh, really?
That number is
your father cites it.
No, it was included in some Creationist publication, but checking it out, it wasn't true.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. But there are certainly billions, anyway, in that deposit. It's a large deposit. These are mostly mammal-like reptiles, connecting links between reptiles and mammals. But in that, you won't find any humans. You won't find any elephant remains. You won't find any really clearly mammalian things. You should. I mean, there are plenty of vertebrate remains preserved there. We're not talking about deep-sea clams. We're talking about continental-type deposits, and they're not there. You should find at least one someplace. One human fossil in a Cambrian rock would certainly be enough to wipe out the evolutionary idea, but it has never been found.
Tell you what, Frank, I'll concede you a point. That's a point for your side, okay? It would be nice, from my way of thinking, to find the fossils a little more mixed up than they are. I think there's a lot of circular reasoning involved in the fossil record. Whenever you find a human fossil, you date it as a recent layer, and there is a lot of circular reasoning there. But what we should find, if the evolutionary scenario is right, we should find in that fossil record the record of types of animals changing into other types of animals. And as is now recognized by every leading evolutionary paleontologist and everybody else, what we find in the fossil record is clams, and we find oysters, and we find trilobites, and nothing in between.
John,
and this, I think, is the biggest argument against the evolutionary scenario
it is
for the creation
absolutely
scenario.
wrong. We have
What's wrong? What's wrong? His assessment?
that
or?
there is no sequence in the rocks. Of
No, what I
connecting
said is there is no transitional forms between basic types
now,
of animals.
in the evolution of the horse, John.
And to say that that's wrong is to disagree with guys like Stephen Gould.
No,
and
Steve
and
agrees
Stanley.
with me. We've discussed this. I know this.
Drop a few names here, Frank. What's it?
Listen, Steve Gould is not
Well, he doesn't
dumb.
write that way. He says there are no transitional forms between these basic body types of animals.
He's talking, all right, well, he's going back to the really, like the phyla, okay? But certainly
No,
between
he's talking
classes.
about orders and classes. That's what
Between
he's talking
classes,
about.
he certainly
even
knows
says
this.
between species.
Well, now you're at two different levels.
I know.
On the one level, we're talking about microevolution and the punctuated equilibrium model.
Which I agree with.
And one species turning into the next species. On the other hand, we're talking about the large-scale transitions, and Steve Gould happens to be an expert on the mammal-like reptiles. I've discussed this with him. These beautifully span the structural continuity from a very primitive type reptile to a primitive type mammal. The entire structure of the jaw and the middle ear structure, which is the way we define mammals, is there to be seen. The evolution of the horse, John. These are in tertiary rocks.
The horse, I'm very confident, is after the flood. Those fossils are from after the flood.
The tertiary deposits are laid down after the flood, then?
Not as a general, I wouldn't say all tertiary deposits are from after the flood, but as a general rule, those tertiary deposits that contain mammal fossils, those few mammal fossils that there are probably from after
Don't
the
we
flood.
have, I thought we had a pretty good scientific way of dating something.
Yeah.
Let me tell you how to date a sedimentary rock, the kinds with fossils in them.
Yeah.
If you find a fossil out in the field somewhere, you take it in the geology department, tell me how old this fossil is. You know what he'll do? He'll turn to his textbook, and he'll look open to the geologic column, and he'll look until he finds a picture of that fossil in this book, say, oh, that fossil lived 300 million years ago, so this fossil is 300 million years old. You cannot date a sedimentary rock or a fossil with the radiometric dating schemes. These only work for lava and granite, things like that, basalt. But not for a sedimentary rock. You date the rocks by the fossils that are in there, and those dates are established by an evolutionary assumption. You betcha it's circular reasoning.
Now, 30 seconds, Frank, and we got to take a break. We got
This
time.
is the way you do it quickly. However, the original sequence, we know that that fossil lived at a certain period and not another by the superposition of the rocks. Okay, this
It's
is
just
how
below
the
the
geologic
other.
column
It's just
was
below
produced
the
in
other,
the first
but
place,
you
John.
don't
You
have
know
a-
that. This
I
was
know
elementary
that.
geology, so
I
you know that. I know
but you don't get a number that way. You get a sequence.
No, you
that
get the sequence. Now, all right, now, from the sequence, then you proceed to use other methods of dating. Many of these sedimentary strata are interspersed with lava flows, which can be dated radiometrically, and despite the various problems in any specific radiometric method, you can use one method to check another, and you
After the
can
commercial, can we talk about
establish that.
radiometric dating?
Yeah,
I'd like to.
Probably not. Let's take a break, because that's really complicated. We'll be right back after a quick break. All right, we're going to talk about this idea of how old the Earth is and this whole idea of dating. So I got to put you on the spot here, Professor Morris. Your contention would be, conservatively, how old, in fact, is the Earth?
You know, I've dug up a lot of rocks in my day, and I've never dug up one with a label on it to tell me how old it is. We've got to interpret those rocks based on what we see in the present, and one of the ways that potentially is a way to date a rock is by measuring the isotopes in there and dating it with radiometric dating. But the assumptions that are involved in those methods, like this one that the present is the key to the past, I think are really in every case questionable at best and wrong in many cases. In fact, the idea of radiometric dating denies at its very core the idea that the Earth might be young. It's not a possibility that those methods would show that the Earth is
Okay,
young.
well, here's what I understand. We're not arguing 4 billion years versus 5 billion years. We're arguing several thousand years versus 4 billion years.
Yeah.
That's a disparity that I can't comprehend.
Yeah.
So
The scientific answer to that question, not an emotional answer, but the scientific answer is that the rock data, the isotope data, is compatible with the idea of an old Earth. And the rock data is compatible with an idea of a young Earth. It can go either way. The rocks don't talk. Let me tell you about a research project that we're working on right now in the Grand
quickly, so I
Canyon.
want to make sure Frank gets responses. Go ahead.
Well, in the Grand Canyon, there are two different lava flows that can be dated by the radiometric dating methods. There's one at the very bottom, one of the oldest rocks, I mean, probably, you know, one of the very earliest rocks, down at the way bottom of the canyon. And then there's another lava flow that's on the very plateau, and even it was a volcano after the canyon was formed, and the stuff spilled down in the canyon. And it's thought by the normal dating methods that that should be just a couple million years old. But with the dating methods, down at the bottom, they've gotten a whole slew of dates, but basically they've now, by using the best methods that's around today, the rubidium-strontium isochron method, dated that at 1.1 billion years. Using that same method, the very same method, the same technique, the same accuracy, they dated the one at the top at 2.6 billion
But that
years.
still puts you out of business because you're saying the Earth's 5,000 years old.
No. I'm just saying that the whole technique is so full of unfounded and probably wrong
But the disparity is mind-boggling.
You should throw one out if it doesn't fit with what you think it ought to be.
We don't have enough time to go into all of the physics involved with radiometric dating. The creationists have screwed it up so badly it takes hours to explain it. But we don't need radiometric dating. For example, we have many rocks that do talk to us very eloquently, and they tell us how long it took for them to be formed. The Green River Shale, which was laid down in the Eocene epoch, has layers in it, very tiny thin layers that are varve-like deposits. They're not true varves, but they are annual deposits. And there are 6 million pairs of these at least. So that would mean that that part of the Eocene epoch had to be 6 million years in length. Now, we know that these are annual deposits, despite your father's muddlement of this, because they follow the 11.5-year thickness variation in like the sunspot cycle. They follow higher astronomical cycles, a 20,000-year precession of the equinox cycle, and so forth. In each layer, we have a very thin amount of clay-like sediment and then an algal mat with spores and sometimes dead leaves and things like that. And these are annual deposits. They follow the 11.5-year cycle.
So in English, this means what?
That means that that hunk of time was at least 6 million years in duration, and that wipes out not only Noah's flood, but the whole mythology of the Bible of creation. The earth was created 4004 BC, if you add up all the begats in the Bible.
Are you comfortable with that date, 4004 BC?
I would say between 6,000 and 10,000 years.
Okay, do we have recorded history of that far back?
Well, recorded history only goes back to about 3000 BC.
Which is what the Bible would...
But, you know, certainly we have overlapping tree rings. Dendrochronology goes back beyond that. You add up the begats, you have Noah's flood in the year 2348 BC. That's in the 5th Egyptian dynasty, the Yao dynasty of China.
May I comment on the Green River oil shales that he's talking about?
Yeah,
before
go
he
right
changes
ahead.
the subject to the Ming dynasty.
Yeah, I wondered about
Actually,
that too.
what he's talking about was thought by some geologists about 40 years ago. But that's an old wives' tale that's really been disproved. It has been shown by a number of observational experiments as well as laboratory experiments that these couplets of layers exactly identical to the Green River oil shales can be formed as events. And in fact, remember I told you about Mount St. Helens, our research project there. One of those eruptions on the side of Mount St. Helens sent a fluidized mud flow down the side of the mountain at about 40 miles an hour, just a wave of mud. It was dry mud filled with gaseous material from the volcano. And it went down whoosh and laid down a deposit about 30 feet thick, full of many thousands of varved layers, just like he's talking about at the Green River. There is more than one way to interpret rocks. He says those rocks talk, but they talk in different languages.
Yeah.
I mean, and
well, you don't get varves there,
ways.
John, at St. Helens, and you cannot produce these 6 million very fine layers over hundreds of square miles.
Also, in these varved layers where there might be 100 of them in a few inches, sometimes there's a fish fossil going right through several of them.
Yes, absolutely.
And this
why
is
should
not
that
10,000s of years,
yes,
while that one fish is just sticking out of the ground, you know. It would decay.
Oh, no. These become
Fish
coated.
don't decay in 10,000 years?
Well, if you have an anoxic environment, they won't. This is why fish are building up right now at the bottom of the Black Sea, for example. You have hydrogen sulfide and things like that will prevent decay. And as a matter of fact, when you look at those fish fossils,
the fish are truncating a number of different varves.
Yes, but
Not
that's
varves,
because these are laid down so
layers.
slowly that they cannot completely cover the skeleton all at once,
so
John.
slowly that fish
We'll be
is
right
going to
back.
sit.
I'll let them talk.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back. Keep going. Okay, we're back. Let me try to ask a more general question, because I have a lot of questions. But, John, why do you think that, for the most part, correct me if I'm wrong, that the churches in this country have somewhat retreated from this strict interpretation of the Bible? And is that fair to say that if you go to a typical Protestant church and talk to them, they'll say, well, evolution is a very nice, the creationism is a very nice story, but we accept evolution. Is that fair?
You know, I think there's a whole shift in opinion on that right now. Back about 1960 or so, there was hardly anybody, any scientist in particular, that believed in creation, young Earth creation. But since 1960, there are many tens of thousands of scientists who, in the study of the data, have rejected an evolutionary scenario and have come over to creationist thinking. There are now hundreds of creationist societies around the country. And the polls that are taken of opinion in America show that something like 80–85% of all Americans believe in creation. They have rejected it. In fact, there are polls taken on university campuses today that show that over 50% of the college students believe in evolution, and the professors are tearing their hair out. What are we doing wrong? We can't get them to believe they came from apes. Well, I'm of the opinion you got to go to school a long time before you believe we come from apes. That's just illogical. We don't come from, I'm here to tell you we don't come from apes.
You know, it's funny. Here I'm sitting beside a man who is 99% identical to a chimpanzee, 98.5% identical to a gorilla in his genes.
And so are you. So
and I am too,
okay.
Sure, yeah. And he cannot see the obvious. Now, certainly if the gorilla and the chimpanzee had been divinely created independent of humans, we would not see this. Not only is our DNA almost identical, it's packaged the same way.
You've got the mind of God, you're claiming.
Well, I'm better than God.
If I was God.
I mean, if I couldn't do better than God, John, I wouldn't be on this show. God can't do anything.
Keep talking. I don't have to repeat this.
Yeah.
Just make
So you are
open your mouth and move all down.
You are 99% chimpanzee.
You're talking about biochemically.
Biochemically in your genes.
What you're saying is that if you were God, you'd have done a better job.
Well, I certainly would. But you answer this. How can you be 99% chimpanzee and not be related to the chimpanzee?
Frank, you know as well as I do that we've only identified a very small portion of the genetic
Well, you know
code.
how we do this DNA hybridization, okay? Now, not only are we that...
The molecular biology that is now, really, the fossils used to be the evidence for evolution.
It's now
but
molecular.
Now, molecular biology, the similarities between organisms.
Right.
But I'll make a prediction. Scientists like to make predictions. For the last 5 years or so, the field of molecular biology has been thought to be a good...
a very good test of the fossil record, sure.
Well, it's a good right jab for the, right cross for the evolutionist. But now that the data is being published, my goodness, what we're seeing is that every animal type, while sure, monkeys are closer genetically to humans than are kangaroos, but when you look at them and you set them all out, every animal type is completely distinct, separate from any other. The isolation of every animal kind is what's coming out of molecular biology. I predict...
Which is within the creationist theme.
I predict that these studies from genetic engineering and molecular biology will be the falsification of evolution theory in the next 5 years.
Well, this is whistling past the graveyard, John. Molecular biology has been the most wonderful proof of what we've been saying all along. Chimpanzee hemoglobin is identical to yours, okay? Not only do we share many of these genes, we even share pseudogenes. That is, God supposedly, if he did all the making of genes, copied erroneous genes that happen to be the same errors.
Frank, that is
Again, we'll be back. I'll let these guys
very
talk over the commercial. We'll be right back. Our guests have left. We thank them. They're going to do marriage enrichment seminars now. It's AM Indiana Academy Award night at the movies. To enter, just send us a postcard with your name and address and phone number, or drop it off at Channel 13, because we got to get it by this Wednesday to be eligible. We're going to have winners, big event. 3 movies have been nominated for Academy Awards, and you'll be able to see one of those. Thanks again to everybody. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Dick